November 28th, 1983, 6:47 hours. Muttlangen, West Germany. Colonel Dmitry Alexandrovich Volkov stood in the rain-soaked forest 2 kilometers from the American missile base, his binoculars focused on the security perimeter where floodlights illuminated concrete bunkers containing weapons that had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. He had been observing this facility for 6 weeks now, documenting every detail he could discern from this distance, correlating his observations with intelligence gathered from other sources, building a comprehensive assessment that he would file with the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the Soviet Armed Forces. And with each passing day, the assessment grew more alarming, the strategic implications more devastating, until Volkov found himself writing reports that he knew would be classified at the highest levels, not because they contained secrets about NATO capabilities, but because they documented Soviet vulnerabilities so profound that acknowledging them would be psychologically devastating to Moscow's leadership. The Pershing II missiles had begun arriving at Muttlangen in late 1983, part of NATO's response to Soviet deployment of SS-20 intermediate-range missiles throughout Eastern Europe. The political negotiations had failed. The zero-option proposal that would have eliminated both American and Soviet intermediate-range missiles had been rejected. And now, the Americans were deploying 108 Pershing II missiles to West Germany, weapons specifically designed to strike deep into Soviet territory with accuracy and speed that made them fundamentally different from any previous NATO nuclear systems. Volkov had been a GRU officer for 19 years, specializing in Western military systems and NATO deployments. He had tracked American weapons programs throughout the 1970s, filed intelligence reports on cruise missiles, tactical nuclear weapons, new fighter aircraft, naval systems. He understood NATO's force structure intimately, could recite from memory the capabilities and limitations of dozens of American weapons systems. He considered himself professionally immune to surprise, ideologically reliable, technically competent. But the Pershing II had shaken his confidence in ways that no previous weapons system had managed. The problem was not simply that the Pershing II was accurate, though its accuracy was extraordinary by the standards of ballistic missiles. The problem was not simply that it was fast, though its flight time from West Germany to Moscow was measured in minutes, rather than the half-hour that Soviet early warning systems were designed to detect and respond to. The problem was that the Pershing II combined accuracy, speed, and targeting flexibility in ways that created a decapitation strike capability, the ability to destroy Soviet political and military leadership before they could authorize retaliation, making the entire concept of mutually assured destruction strategically irrelevant. Volkov lowered his binoculars and consulted his notes, reviewing the technical specifications that he had compiled from multiple intelligence sources. The Pershing II was a 2-stage solid-fuel ballistic missile developed by Martin Marietta, measuring 10.6 meters in length with a diameter of 1.0 meters. Launch weight was approximately 7,500 kilograms. Maximum range was 1,270 kilometers, sufficient to reach targets deep inside the Soviet Union from deployment sites in West Germany. The missile carried a single W-85 nuclear warhead with variable yield ranging from 5 to 80 kilotons, enough to destroy hardened underground bunkers if delivered with sufficient accuracy. And the accuracy was what made the Pershing II fundamentally different from every previous ballistic missile ever deployed. Traditional ballistic missiles followed predictable trajectories determined by their initial launch parameters. They were accurate enough to destroy large targets like cities or industrial complexes, but their circular error probable, the radius within which half of all warheads would land, measured hundreds of meters at best. This made them unsuitable for attacks against hardened point targets like missile silos or command bunkers, which required direct hits or very near misses to destroy. The Pershing II incorporated a terminal guidance system that Volkov understood conceptually but found difficult to believe could work reliably in combat conditions. The system was called radar area correlation, and it functioned by comparing real-time radar images of the target area with pre-stored reference images during the final phase of the missile's descent. As the warhead re-entered the atmosphere above the target, a small radar unit would activate and begin scanning the terrain below. The onboard computer would compare these radar returns with digital maps stored in its memory, identify the precise location of the missile relative to its intended target, and make final course corrections to ensure the warhead struck within meters of the aim point. The reported accuracy was extraordinary. Intelligence assessments suggested a circular error probable of 30 to 40 meters, more than an order of magnitude better than previous ballistic missiles. At that accuracy level, the Pershing II could reliably destroy hardened bunkers, command posts, communication facilities, missile silos, any target that could be precisely located and mapped. And the warhead's variable yield meant that mission planners could optimize the explosion for different target types, using lower yields to minimize collateral damage or higher yields to ensure destruction of deeply buried facilities. But accuracy alone was not what made Volkov's reports so alarming to Moscow. The critical factor was flight time. A Pershing II launched from Mutlangen would reach Moscow in approximately 6 to 8 minutes depending on the exact trajectory and target location. Soviet early warning systems were designed to detect intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from the United States, which required 25 to 30 minutes to reach Soviet territory. Those systems provided time for Soviet leadership to be alerted, evacuated to hardened bunkers, and to authorize retaliatory strikes before American warheads arrived. The entire Soviet nuclear strategy was based on assured retaliation, the certainty that any American attack would be met with devastating counterattack that would destroy American cities even if the Soviet Union was destroyed in the process. The Pershing II made that strategy obsolete. 6 to 8 minutes was not sufficient time to evacuate leadership, authorize retaliation, and execute counterstrikes. By the time Soviet radar detected Pershing II launches, by the time that information was communicated to command authorities, by the time anyone decided how to respond, the warheads would already have arrived. If those warheads were targeted against Soviet leadership bunkers and command and control facilities, the entire decision-making apparatus of the Soviet state could be decapitated before they could order retaliation. Volkov had written these assessments in his preliminary reports filed in October, shortly after the first Pershing II systems became operational. The response from Moscow had been immediate and alarming. His reports had been classified at levels requiring special authorization for access. He had been ordered to continue surveillance and provide updated assessments as additional intelligence became available. And he had been told, in carefully diplomatic language, that his findings were being taken very seriously at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. That euphemistic phrasing meant that his reports had terrified people in the Kremlin. They had confirmed what Soviet military planners most feared, that NATO was deploying a genuine first strike capability that could destroy Soviet retaliatory forces before they could respond. This fundamentally altered the strategic balance in ways that made Soviet nuclear deterrence questionable. If the Americans believed they could execute a decapitation strike that would prevent Soviet retaliation, they might be tempted to launch such a strike during a crisis. And even if they had no intention of attacking, the mere existence of the capability would force Soviet leadership to consider preemptive action, launching their own strikes before the Americans could strike first. The rain intensified, and Volkov retreated deeper into the forest, finding shelter beneath a thick stand of pines. He had been operating in West Germany for 3 months now, officially assigned to the Soviet embassy in Bonn, with diplomatic cover as a trade representative. His actual duties involved surveillance of American military installations, recruitment of sources with access to NATO planning, and compilation of intelligence assessments on Western military capabilities. It was dangerous work that required constant vigilance against West German counterintelligence, but the risks were acceptable given the strategic importance of the intelligence he was gathering. His surveillance of the Mutlangen facility had documented the deployment schedule for the Pershing II missiles, the security procedures protecting them, the training activities of American personnel operating the systems. He had observed test exercises where crews practiced launch procedures, noting the speed with which the missiles could be prepared for firing. The Pershing II was mounted on a mobile transporter erector launcher that could be rapidly relocated to avoid targeting by Soviet forces. The missiles could be fired within minutes of receiving launch orders, much faster than older systems that required extensive pre-launch preparation. But the most troubling intelligence had come not from his personal observations, but from a source within the West German Defense Ministry, a mid-level official whose access to NATO planning documents made him one of the GRU's most valuable agents in Western Europe. This source had provided copies of American targeting plans for the Pershing II force, documents that detailed exactly which Soviet facilities the missiles were intended to strike in the event of war. The targeting list had confirmed Volkov's worst fears. The Pershing II force was not assigned against Soviet missiles or military bases in any significant numbers. Instead, the primary targets were Soviet leadership bunkers, communication facilities, command posts, and government installations in and around Moscow. The Americans were planning a decapitation strike designed to destroy Soviet decision-making capability in the opening minutes of a conflict, before Soviet leaders could order retaliation. The specific targets included the deep underground bunker complex at Sharapovo, approximately 40 kilometers southwest of Moscow, where Soviet political and military leadership would relocate during a crisis. They included the alternative command post at Ramenki, built beneath Moscow State University. They included communication facilities that connected Soviet leadership with strategic nuclear forces. The targeting plan was comprehensive and sophisticated, designed to sever the chain of command that connected political authority with nuclear weapons, rendering Soviet retaliatory forces leaderless and unable to execute coordinated counterstrikes. Volkov had filed a 47-page report documenting these targeting plans in early November. The report had been classified top secret with the additional designation requiring immediate leadership attention. He had received confirmation that the report had been personally briefed to Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov and potentially to General Secretary Yuri Andropov himself. The response had been swift and revealing. Soviet military forces throughout Eastern Europe had been placed on heightened alert status. Additional intelligence resources had been assigned to monitor NATO activities for signs of attack preparations, and Volkov had been ordered to provide daily updates on any changes in Pershing II deployment status or American force posture. The atmosphere in Moscow, from what Volkov could gather through his communications with GRU headquarters, was approaching panic. Soviet leadership genuinely feared that NATO might be preparing for a first strike, that the Pershing II deployment was a prelude to attack rather than simply a deterrent system. This fear had been intensified by Operation Ryan, a massive Soviet intelligence collection effort initiated in 1981 to detect preparations for nuclear war. Ryan was an acronym from the Russian phrase Raketno-Yadерное Napadenie, meaning nuclear missile attack, and it represented the largest peacetime intelligence operation in Soviet history. Operation Ryan required Soviet intelligence officers throughout the West to monitor hundreds of indicators that might suggest NATO was preparing for war. They tracked blood bank inventory levels, reasoning that NATO would stockpile blood products before attacking. They monitored the lights in government buildings at night, looking for unusual activity that might indicate crisis planning. They observed the movement of Western leaders, noting any patterns that might suggest preparations for nuclear war. It was a comprehensive intelligence collection program, but it was also deeply flawed because it started from the assumption that NATO was actively planning a first strike and interpreted ambiguous evidence as confirmation of that preconception. Volkov found himself contributing to this paranoid intelligence cycle. His reports on Pershing II capabilities were accurate and professionally compiled, but he knew they were being read in Moscow through a lens of fear and worst-case assumptions. When he reported that the Pershing II could reach Moscow in 6 minutes, Moscow interpreted this as evidence that NATO was preparing a decapitation strike. When he documented American targeting plans against Soviet leadership bunkers, Moscow saw this as proof of aggressive intentions, rather than standard contingency planning that any responsible military would conduct. The most recent crisis had occurred in early November during a NATO exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was a routine command post drill designed to practice nuclear release procedures and ensure that NATO's nuclear chain of command functioned properly. But Soviet intelligence had observed unusual patterns during the exercise. Communications were encrypted at higher classification levels than normal. Senior NATO officials participated in the drill, including people who would be involved in actual nuclear decision-making. And the exercise scenario appeared to escalate from conventional conflict to nuclear release, following a pattern that Soviet planners believed might be used to disguise actual attack preparations. Soviet military forces had responded by increasing their alert status to levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear-capable aircraft had been placed on increased readiness. Submarine patrols had been intensified. Intelligence collection against NATO had been stepped up across Europe. For several days in early November, the Soviet Union had been operating under the assumption that nuclear war might be imminent, that NATO's exercise might transition into actual attack. The crisis had passed when Able Archer concluded without any attack materializing. But the episode had demonstrated just how close the world had come to miscalculation, based on mutual fear and misunderstanding. And Volkov understood that his own intelligence reports had contributed to that crisis atmosphere by documenting capabilities that made Soviet leadership believe they were genuinely vulnerable to a decapitation strike they could not defend against. He had been trained to report intelligence objectively, to document facts without editorializing or allowing political considerations to influence his assessments. But he found himself questioning whether objective reporting was sufficient when that reporting was being interpreted through frameworks of paranoia and worst-case thinking. His accurate reports on Pershing II capabilities were factually correct, but they were contributing to a crisis atmosphere that might actually increase the risk of war, rather than providing the information necessary for rational strategic planning. On November 15th, Volkov had filed a supplemental assessment that attempted to provide context for his earlier reports. He had noted that while the Pershing II provided NATO with a theoretical decapitation strike capability, actually executing such a strike would be extraordinarily difficult in practice. The Americans would need perfect intelligence on the locations of Soviet leadership at the moment of attack. They would need to coordinate dozens of missile launches within minutes to prevent Soviet leaders from relocating after the first impacts. They would need to ensure that every warhead reached its target with perfect accuracy, because any surviving Soviet leadership would retain the ability to order retaliation. And they would need to accept that even a partially successful decapitation strike might not prevent Soviet nuclear forces from executing pre-planned retaliation if communication with leadership was lost. The supplemental assessment had argued that the Pershing II should be understood as a deterrent system designed to hold Soviet leadership at risk, pressuring Moscow to exercise restraint during crises, rather than as a practical first-strike weapon that NATO actually intended to use preemptively. This was consistent with Western nuclear strategy, which had always been based on deterrence rather than actual warfighting. The Americans deployed nuclear weapons to prevent war by making the costs of aggression unacceptable, not because they wanted to fight and win nuclear conflicts. The response from Moscow had been dismissive. His supplemental assessment had been filed and apparently ignored, while his earlier reports documenting Pershing II capabilities continued to be cited in intelligence briefings and strategic planning. Volkov understood the message. Moscow wanted intelligence that confirmed their fears, not analysis that suggested those fears might be exaggerated. They were trapped in a mindset that interpreted everything through the lens of threat and vulnerability, unable to consider the possibility that NATO's deployments might be genuinely defensive rather than preparations for attack. Volkov's colleague, Major Sergei Petrov, had filed even more alarming assessments based on his surveillance of Pershing II facilities in southern Germany. Petrov had documented the missile's rapid reaction capabilities, calculating that the American crews could launch within 10 to 15 minutes of receiving orders. He had observed the security procedures protecting the weapons. noting that American Nuclear Release Authority was carefully controlled, but could be executed quickly during a crisis. And he had filed technical assessments suggesting that the Pershing II's terminal guidance system was reliable enough to achieve its advertised accuracy under combat conditions. Petrov's reports had been classified with the notation potentially destabilizing to strategic balance, a designation that Volkov had never seen before. The classification implied that the information was so sensitive, so threatening to Soviet security, that its distribution needed to be strictly limited even within the intelligence community. Volkov had discussed this designation with Petrov during a clandestine meeting in Frankfurt in late October. "They are calling our reports suicide-level intelligence," Petrov had said quietly, his voice bitter. "Not because the information is inaccurate or exaggerated, but because acknowledging what we have documented means accepting that Soviet nuclear strategy is no longer viable. We have filed reports that prove our leadership is vulnerable to decapitation, that our retaliatory capability can be neutralized, that the entire foundation of mutually assured destruction no longer protects us. These are truths that Moscow cannot acknowledge without fundamentally rethinking everything about how we approach nuclear deterrence." "Suicide level," Volkov had repeated, testing the phrase. Because accepting the truth would be psychologically devastating to Soviet leadership. They would have to admit that NATO has achieved strategic superiority, that Soviet vulnerability is real and perhaps insurmountable given our current capabilities. Exactly. So they classify our reports at the highest levels, restrict distribution to a handful of people, and continue operating as if the problem does not exist. They cannot respond effectively without admitting the problem, and they cannot admit the problem without undermining their own legitimacy and authority. The conversation had haunted Volkov for weeks afterward. He and Petrov were competent intelligence officers doing their jobs professionally, filing accurate assessments based on solid evidence. But their work product was being classified not to protect sources and methods, not to prevent NATO from learning what Soviet intelligence knew, but to prevent Soviet leadership and military planners from having to confront uncomfortable realities about their strategic situation. By late November, additional intelligence had made the situation even more alarming. A source within the American defense industry had provided technical specifications for the Pershing II's terminal guidance system, including details about the radar unit and the digital terrain matching algorithms. The information confirmed that the system's advertised accuracy was achievable and that American engineers had solved the technical challenges of correlating radar images with stored maps at the high speeds involved in ballistic missile reentry. Volkov had incorporated this intelligence into his most recent comprehensive assessment, filed on November 22nd. The report ran to 73 pages, dense with technical details, operational analysis, and strategic implications. His conclusion was unambiguous and devastating. The Pershing II represented a fundamental shift in the strategic balance. Soviet leadership and command and control facilities were now vulnerable to attack with warning times too short to permit effective response. Soviet nuclear strategy, based on assured retaliation, was no longer credible against this weapon system. Defending against the threat would require either developing comparable weapons to hold NATO leadership at similar risk, deploying defensive systems capable of intercepting the missiles during their brief flight time, or negotiating arms control agreements that eliminated the weapons entirely. The report had been filed 6 days ago. Volkov had not yet received any response from Moscow, which was unusual. Typically, important intelligence assessments were acknowledged within 24 to 48 hours, even if detailed analysis and decisions took longer. The silence suggested that his report was being considered at the highest levels, that it had reached people who needed time to absorb its implications before formulating a response. Volkov checked his watch. 0723 hours. He had been in the forest for nearly 2 hours conducting surveillance in conditions that were miserable but necessary. He had documented that 3 additional Pershing II transporter erector launchers had arrived at Mutlungen overnight, increasing the total number of deployed systems. He had photographed the convoy from a concealed position, capturing images that would be transmitted to Moscow through secure channels. And he had observed enough to confirm that the American deployment schedule was proceeding on time, that all 108 planned Pershing II missiles would be operational by early 1984. He began the careful process of extracting from his surveillance position, moving through the forest in a route designed to avoid any areas where he might be observed by American security or West German police. His diplomatic cover would protect him from arrest if he was caught, but being identified as an intelligence officer would compromise his ability to operate in West Germany and potentially expose his sources. The standard procedure was to vary his surveillance patterns, never approaching the same facility from the same direction twice, never maintaining observation positions for longer than 3 hours, never doing anything that might establish a pattern that counterintelligence could detect. 2 hours later, Volkov was in his car driving toward Bonn, his surveillance materials concealed in a diplomatic pouch that would be immune to search even if he was stopped. He was scheduled to meet with his case officer that afternoon to transfer the materials for transmission to Moscow and to receive any new taskings or intelligence requirements. But his mind was still focused on the strategic implications of what he had been documenting for the past 3 months. The Soviet Union was trapped in an impossible position. The Pershing II deployment had created a vulnerability that Soviet forces could not effectively defend against with current capabilities. Developing comparable weapons would take years and would simply perpetuate the destabilizing situation by putting both sides' leadership at risk. Defensive systems capable of intercepting ballistic missiles in their terminal phase did not exist and would be extraordinarily difficult to develop. Arms control negotiations might eliminate the weapons, but such negotiations would require the Soviet Union to make concessions, probably including elimination of their own SS-20 missiles, and would be seen domestically as admitting to strategic weakness. Every option was unacceptable in different ways, and Moscow's response had been to classify the intelligence, restrict its distribution, and essentially pretend the problem was less severe than Volkov's reports indicated. They were choosing psychological denial over strategic adaptation, maintaining comfortable fictions rather than confronting uncomfortable realities. The meeting with his case officer, Colonel Ivan Zhukov, took place in a safe house in a Bonn suburb. Zhukov was a career GRU officer who coordinated intelligence collection activities throughout West Germany, managing a network of officers and sources that provided continuous reporting on NATO military activities. He was competent and experienced, but Volkov detected signs of strain in his demeanor, tension that suggested the reports from the field were having impacts throughout the intelligence hierarchy. Your assessment from November 22nd has been read by everyone who matters, Zhukov said without preamble once they were alone in the safe house's secure conference room. Defense Minister Ustinov personally briefed General Secretary Andropov. Your findings were discussed in a special Politburo session, and the response has been classified in ways that make further distribution almost impossible. What classification? Volkov asked, though he suspected he already knew. State secret of the highest importance with additional restrictions limiting access to personnel with specific authorization. I have not been authorized to see the full response, only to relay certain instructions to you. But I have been told that your reports are being taken very seriously and that the information you have provided has influenced strategic planning at the highest levels. Influenced how? Zhukov hesitated, clearly uncertain how much he should reveal. The leadership is genuinely alarmed. They believe NATO may be preparing for a first strike. They have ordered increased intelligence collection to detect any signs of attack preparations. And they are considering various response options, though I have not been informed what those options might be. Volkov absorbed this carefully. Colonel, do you believe NATO is preparing to attack? Another hesitation. I am not authorized to express personal opinions on strategic matters. I am asking as one intelligence professional to another. Based on everything you have seen and analyzed, do you genuinely believe the Americans are planning a first strike? Zhukov was silent for a long moment, weighing his words. I believe the Americans have deployed weapons that give them a first strike capability. I believe Soviet leadership is vulnerable in ways we have not been before. But I do not believe NATO is actively planning an unprovoked attack. Their deployment of Pershing II is a response to our deployment of S-20. It is an action-reaction cycle driven by mutual fear and strategic competition, not by aggressive intentions. However, my beliefs are irrelevant if leadership in Moscow interprets the situation differently. It was the most candid assessment Volkov had heard from a senior officer, and it confirmed his own analysis. The crisis was driven not by actual NATO intentions, but by Soviet perceptions and fears, perceptions that were being reinforced by intelligence reports like the ones Volkov was filing. The reports were accurate, but accuracy alone could not prevent misunderstanding and miscalculation. "What are my new instructions?" Volkov asked. "Continue surveillance of Pershing II facilities. Monitor for any changes in deployment status, alert levels, or operational procedures. Report immediately any indicators that might suggest attack preparations, and provide weekly assessments of NATO force posture in your area of responsibility." Standard tasking that would keep Volkov focused on gathering intelligence while providing no guidance on how that intelligence would be used or interpreted. He was a collector, not an analyst or policymaker. His job was to report facts, and others would determine what those facts meant and how to respond. But he found himself unable to remain entirely passive. "Colonel, with respect, I believe my reports may be contributing to an exaggerated sense of threat in Moscow. The Pershing II is a capable weapons system, but executing a successful decapitation strike would be extraordinarily difficult in practice. NATO has many reasons to avoid nuclear war, and deploying a capability is not the same as intending to use it preemptively." Zhukov gave him a sharp look. "Major, you are an intelligence officer, not a strategic planner. Your job is to document what you observe and analyze technical capabilities, not to speculate about political intentions or provide reassurance to leadership. Moscow will decide how to interpret the intelligence you provide. You will continue filing accurate reports regardless of how those reports are received." It was a rebuke, politely delivered but unmistakable. Volkov understood the message. He had overstepped his authority by suggesting that his reports might be misinterpreted. His job was to collect and analyze intelligence, not to question how that intelligence was being used. "Understood, Colonel. I will continue my assigned duties." The meeting concluded shortly afterward, and Volkov returned to his cover duties at the embassy. But the conversation with Zhukov stayed with him, reinforcing his sense that he was participating in a process that was inherently dysfunctional. Soviet intelligence was collecting accurate information about Western capabilities, but that information was being filtered through assumptions and fears that made rational assessment nearly impossible. The result was a feedback loop where intelligence confirmed pre-existing beliefs, which reinforced the assumptions that shaped intelligence collection, creating an escalating cycle of threat perception that might lead to crisis, even though neither side actually wanted war. Over the following weeks, Volkov continued his surveillance activities and filed regular reports documenting Pershing II deployment. By mid-December 1983, all 108 missiles were operational at bases throughout West Germany. The deployment had been completed on schedule despite massive peace demonstrations and political opposition within West Germany. NATO had demonstrated its resolve, and the strategic balance had shifted in ways that Soviet leadership found profoundly threatening. Volkov's reports from this period were comprehensive and professionally compiled, but they carried an increasingly desperate tone as he documented capabilities that he knew Moscow could not effectively counter. The final report he filed in 1983, dated December 28th, included a passage that captured his state of mind after 3 months of documenting a weapons system that had fundamentally altered the strategic environment. The Pershing II represents a technological achievement that Soviet industry cannot currently match. Its accuracy, speed, and operational flexibility create vulnerabilities in Soviet strategic posture that cannot be eliminated through defensive measures using existing capabilities. The weapons place Soviet leadership and command and control at risk in ways that make assured retaliation questionable. This situation is strategically unstable and psychologically intolerable to Soviet decision-makers. The deployment has succeeded in creating exactly the sense of vulnerability and threat that NATO intended. But this success may increase rather than decrease the risk of conflict by pressuring Soviet leadership to consider preemptive action during crises. The report was filed and classified at the highest levels. Volkov never learned what response it generated or how it influenced Soviet strategic planning, but he later learned that his characterization of the intelligence as psychologically intolerable had been noted by senior officials, who recognized that the reports from Germany were not just documenting NATO capabilities, but revealing Soviet weaknesses that threatened the entire foundation of Soviet nuclear strategy. In retrospect, historians would recognize 1983 as perhaps the most dangerous year of the Cold War, a period when mutual fear and misunderstanding brought the superpowers closer to nuclear conflict than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Pershing II deployment was a major factor in creating that dangerous atmosphere, not because NATO actually intended to launch a first strike, but because Soviet leadership genuinely believed they might, and because intelligence officers like Volkov were filing reports that confirmed those fears with accurate technical data about capabilities that were genuinely threatening. The crisis atmosphere gradually subsided in 1984 as both sides stepped back from the brink. Soviet leadership came to understand that NATO was not preparing an imminent attack. The Able Archer exercise had been routine rather than cover for actual war preparations. And the intelligence reports that had seemed so alarming in late 1983 were reinterpreted as documenting capabilities that, while real, did not necessarily indicate aggressive intentions. But the Pershing II missiles remained in place, a constant reminder of Soviet vulnerability. Volkov continued his intelligence work, filing reports that documented the capabilities and limitations of NATO weapon systems. And he carried with him the knowledge that his professionally compiled assessments had contributed to a crisis that brought the world disturbingly close to nuclear war. Not through any inaccuracy or exaggeration, but simply by documenting truths that Soviet leadership found psychologically intolerable. In 1987, the United States and Soviet Union signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated all ground-based missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. The treaty required the destruction of 2,792 missiles, including all 108 deployed Pershing IIs and all 654 Soviet SS-20s. The weapons that had brought the superpowers to the brink of war were eliminated entirely, removed from both arsenals under strict verification procedures that allowed each side to observe the destruction of the other's missiles. Volkov attended the destruction of the Mut-Langen missiles in 1988 as part of the Soviet inspection team, verifying American compliance with the treaty. He watched as the weapons were pulled from their storage bunkers, placed on flatbed trailers, and transported to a destruction facility where they would be cut apart and rendered permanently unusable. It should have been a moment of satisfaction. Watching the elimination of weapons that had created such strategic instability and had nearly caused a nuclear war. But Volkov found himself reflecting on the 4 years between deployment and elimination, years when the existence of these weapons had poisoned relations between the superpowers and created a crisis atmosphere that distorted strategic calculations on both sides. He thought about the reports he had filed in 1983, accurate and professional assessments that had been classified as suicide-level intelligence because they documented vulnerabilities that Soviet leadership could not acknowledge without psychological devastation. He thought about how those reports had contributed to the crisis atmosphere, reinforcing fears and worst-case assumptions that made conflict seem imminent even when neither side actually wanted war. And he wondered whether intelligence work that was technically accurate could still be strategically counterproductive if it was interpreted through frameworks of fear and paranoia that prevented rational assessment. Years later, after the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, Volkov gave an interview to a Russian military history journal. The interviewer asked about his work monitoring Pershing II deployment and what lessons he had learned from that experience. I learned that intelligence officers can file perfect reports and still contribute to disaster, Volkov said. My assessments of Pershing II capabilities were accurate. Every technical specification I documented was correct. But accuracy is not enough when your reports are being read by people who are looking for confirmation of their fears rather than objective assessment of threats. We were trapped in a system that could not distinguish between capability and intention, that interpreted every NATO deployment as evidence of aggressive plans rather than defensive deterrence. And our accurate intelligence reports fed that paranoid interpretation by documenting genuine capabilities without adequate context about how those capabilities fit into Western strategic thinking. Do you believe you should have reported differently? The interviewer asked. Volkov was silent for a long moment. I believe the system was broken in ways that made accurate reporting insufficient. Intelligence requires not just good collection and analysis, but also rational interpretation and response. When the decision makers receiving your intelligence are operating from assumptions of imminent threat and worst-case scenarios, when they are psychologically committed to seeing every development as confirmation of danger, then accurate intelligence can actually make the situation worse by providing facts that support those preconceptions. I filed reports describing suicide-level vulnerabilities because that was the accurate assessment. But those reports contributed to a crisis that nearly resulted in the suicide of both our nations through nuclear war. It was a haunting conclusion to a career spent gathering intelligence that was supposed to help Soviet leadership make informed strategic decisions. Volkov had done his job professionally and accurately, and his reward had been to watch his reports contribute to the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War, as Moscow interpreted his accurate findings through lenses of fear that made rational response nearly impossible. The Pershing II missiles were gone now, eliminated by treaty, and destroyed under international supervision. But the lesson remained. Accurate intelligence is necessary but not sufficient for strategic stability. What matters is not just what capabilities exist, but how those capabilities are understood and interpreted by decision makers operating under the psychological pressures of fear, ideology, and worst-case planning. Volkov had filed suicide-level reports not because his assessments were wrong, but because the truths they documented were psychologically intolerable to leadership that could not acknowledge vulnerability without seeing themselves as already defeated. And in the end, that inability to acknowledge uncomfortable truths that need to classify accurate intelligence as too dangerous to confront contributed more to the strategic instability than the weapons themselves ever could.